What happened when your doctor prescribed medication that made you sicker on purpose? I collapsed in the grocery store parking lot 3 weeks after Dr. Whitmore started me on the new medication. My wife found me slumped against our car, unable to remember how I'd gotten there or why my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't hold my keys. The tremors had started small, just a slight quiver in my fingers that I'd mentioned at my last appointment. Dr. Whitmore had increased my dosage that same day, saying my body needed time to adjust to the treatment. Now I was on the ground with strangers calling 911 while my vision blurred and my heart hammered against my ribs. The paramedics asked what medications I was taking, and I rattled off the names from memory. They exchanged a look I couldn't interpret before loading me into the ambulance. The emergency room doctor was a woman in her 50s who listened to my symptoms with increasing concern. She asked how long I'd been on this particular combination of medications, and I told her 6 months, ever since Dr. Whitmore had taken over my care when my previous doctor retired. She examined my chart and then asked if I knew what these medications were typically prescribed for. I explained that Dr. Whitmore had diagnosed me with an autoimmune condition after running extensive tests. The ER doctor's expression changed to something that looked like anger mixed with disbelief. She said these medications weren't for autoimmune conditions at all. They were for completely different issues, and the combination was actually contraindicated, meaning they shouldn't be taken together because they caused dangerous interactions. I felt my stomach drop as she explained that the tremors, memory loss, and fatigue I'd been experiencing weren't symptoms of my supposed condition getting worse. They were side effects of medications I shouldn't have been taking in the first place. She said my blood work showed signs of toxicity consistent with prolonged exposure to this drug combination. When I asked why Dr. Whitmore would prescribe something so dangerous, she said she couldn't speculate but strongly recommended I see a different physician immediately and bring copies of all my medical records. She said this needed to be reported because if it was happening to me, it might be happening to other patients. Her words felt surreal, like she was describing something from a medical drama rather than my actual life. My wife drove me home in complete silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. When we got inside, she went straight to the filing cabinet where we kept medical paperwork and pulled out every document related to Dr. Whitmore's treatment. We spread them across the dining room table and started reading through test results and prescriptions and appointment notes. Nothing made sense once you knew what to look for. The lab values he'd circled as abnormal were actually within normal ranges according to the reference numbers printed right next to them. The symptoms he'd documented didn't match what I'd actually reported during appointments. It was all there in black and white, a paper trail of falsified information that had led to 6 months of poisoning. I called Dr. Whitmore's office the next morning, and his receptionist said he could see me in 2 weeks. I told her I needed to speak with him immediately about my medication, and she put me on hold for several minutes before coming back to say the doctor was reviewing my file and would call me back that afternoon. He never called. I tried again the next day and got the same runaround. On the third day, I drove to his office without an appointment and told the receptionist I wasn't leaving until I spoke with him. She disappeared into the back and returned with a nurse who said Dr. Whitmore was with patients, but could I describe my concerns? I told her I'd been hospitalized because of the medications he prescribed and needed answers about why I was on drugs that were contraindicated. Her face went carefully blank, and she said she'd have the doctor call me as soon as possible. My wife found a new physician through her coworker, a doctor named Patricia Ramos, who practiced at a different hospital system. Dr. Ramos saw me within 3 days and spent nearly 2 hours going through my complete medical history. She ordered new tests and compared them to the ones Dr. Whitmore had run. When the results came back, she sat across from me with an expression of barely controlled fury. She said there was absolutely nothing wrong with me. No autoimmune condition, no underlying disease process, nothing that would justify the medications Dr. Whitmore had prescribed. She said my current symptoms were entirely iatrogenic, meaning caused by medical treatment itself. She was immediately stopping all medications and putting me on a supervised detox protocol to clear the drugs from my system safely. I asked Dr. Ramos directly why another physician would do this, and she said she didn't know, but she was legally obligated to report it to the state medical board. She said what Dr. Whitmore had done wasn't a simple mistake or misdiagnosis. It was a pattern of falsifying records and prescribing dangerous drug combinations that had made me genuinely ill. She used the word deliberate and let it hang in the air between us. When I asked if she thought he'd done this to other patients, she said I should assume yes, and that I needed to contact a lawyer immediately. She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in medical malpractice and told me to document everything I could remember about every appointment and every symptom. The attorney's name was Richard Flores, and he listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, he asked if I still had all my medical records and prescription bottles. I told him yes, and he said bring everything to his office tomorrow. He explained that medical Malpractice cases were difficult to prove because they required showing that a doctor deviated from the standard of care and that this deviation caused measurable harm. In my case, the harm was obvious, but proving intent would be harder. He said if Dr. Whitmore had done this deliberately, there would likely be other victims, and finding them would strengthen any case we might build. He asked if I was prepared for a long legal battle that might take years and cost significant money up front. I spent the next week in withdrawal as my body cleared the medications from my system. The tremors got worse before they got better. I had night sweats and nausea and periods where I couldn't think clearly enough to hold a conversation. My wife took time off work to stay home with me because I wasn't safe to be alone. During those long days, I kept returning to the same questions. Why would a doctor deliberately poison his patients? What did he gain from making us sick? I couldn't find answers that made sense, and the not knowing was almost worse than the physical symptoms. Dr. Ramos checked on me daily by phone and adjusted my detox protocol as needed. She kept telling me I was lucky I'd collapsed when I did because another few months on those medications could have caused permanent organ damage. Richard called 2 weeks later and asked me to come to his office. When I arrived, there were 3 other people sitting in his conference room. He introduced them as former patients of Dr. Whitmore who'd experienced similar issues. A woman named Claire described being treated for a thyroid condition that didn't exist and prescribed medications that made her gain 60 pounds and develop severe anxiety. A man named Tom had been told he had early-stage liver disease and given drugs that actually damaged his liver further. A younger woman named Alicia said Dr. Whitmore had diagnosed her with a neurological disorder and prescribed medications that caused seizures she'd never had before. All of them had eventually sought second opinions and discovered they'd been systematically poisoned. Richard explained that he'd contacted the state medical board and learned that Dr. Whitmore had already been under investigation for similar complaints from 3 other patients. The board had been moving slowly, conducting their review while allowing him to continue practicing. Richard said our combined cases provided enough evidence to force immediate action. He'd already filed formal complaints on behalf of each of us and sent copies to the local media. He said exposure was our best weapon because regulatory bodies often protected doctors rather than patients, but public pressure could force them to act. He warned us that going public would be difficult and that Dr. Whitmore might fight back aggressively, but we all agreed it was necessary to prevent him from hurting anyone else. The local news ran the story 3 days later. A reporter named Dennis Kumar had interviewed all 4 of us and obtained copies of medical records showing the pattern of falsified diagnoses and dangerous prescriptions. The broadcast included an interview with an independent medical expert who reviewed the cases and confirmed that Dr. Whitmore's treatment decisions had no legitimate medical justification. The story ended with information about how to file complaints with the medical board and a request for other potential victims to come forward. My phone started ringing within an hour. Friends and acquaintances who'd seen the broadcast, people asking if I was okay, former co-workers expressing shock. My wife fielded most of the calls while I tried to process the strange feeling of having my medical trauma broadcast to thousands of people. 12 more patients contacted Richard's office within the first week. Each one described similar experiences with Dr. Whitmore, diagnosing conditions they didn't have, and prescribing medications that made them severely ill. Some had been seeing him for years, gradually getting sicker while he adjusted their dosages and added new drugs. One man had lost his job because he became too ill to work. A woman had been hospitalized 3 times for complications that her new doctors later determined were entirely medication-induced. Another patient had developed genuine health problems from the long-term effects of unnecessary drugs. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. Dr. Whitmore had been systematically poisoning his patients for years. The state medical board finally suspended Dr. Whitmore's license pending a full investigation. The announcement came through a terse press release that didn't acknowledge the board had known about complaints for months while letting him continue practicing. Richard immediately filed a lawsuit on behalf of all 16 patients who'd come forward, alleging medical malpractice, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit demanded access to Dr. Whitmore's complete patient records and financial documents. Richard said following the money was crucial because there had to be a reason why a doctor would systematically harm his patients. People didn't commit crimes this elaborate without some kind of benefit. The answer came from an unexpected source. A pharmaceutical sales representative named Grace contacted Richard's office, saying she had information about Dr. Whitmore's prescribing patterns. Richard brought me to the meeting because he said I had a right to hear this directly. Grace explained that she'd worked for a company that manufactured several of the medications Dr. Whitmore had prescribed to me and other patients. She said pharmaceutical companies paid doctors for prescribing their drugs through various incentive programs that were technically legal but ethically questionable. Doctors received speaking fees, consulting payments, and research grants based on their prescription volumes. Dr. Whitmore had been one of the highest volume prescribers in the region for several expensive medications. Grace showed us documents tracking Dr. Whitmore's income from pharmaceutical companies over a 5-year period. He'd received over $2 million in payments disguised as consulting fees, speaker honorariums, and research funding. The payments correlated directly with spikes in his prescribing of specific drugs. When one company launched a new medication, his prescriptions for that drug increased dramatically. The same quarter, he received a large consulting payment. Grace said this kind of arrangement wasn't uncommon, but Dr. Whitmore had taken it to an extreme level. He wasn't just overprescribing to patients who might benefit. He was creating fake diagnoses to justify prescribing expensive medications to healthy people. The pharmaceutical companies likely knew or should have known that his prescribing patterns were suspicious, but they kept paying him because it boosted their sales numbers. Richard amended our lawsuit to include the pharmaceutical companies as defendants, alleging they'd enabled and profited from Dr. Whitmore's scheme. The companies immediately filed motions to dismiss, arguing they couldn't be held responsible for an individual doctor's criminal conduct. Richard countered that their payment records showed they'd incentivized the exact behavior that had harmed us. The case was assigned to a judge named Eleanor Briggs, who had a reputation for being tough on corporate malfeasance. She denied the company's motion to dismiss and ordered them to produce all documents related to their financial relationship with Dr. Whitmore. The companies appealed, but Judge Briggs upheld her ruling. The case was moving forward. Discovery took 8 months and revealed the full scope of Dr. Whitmore's operation. He'd been systematically targeting patients he perceived as vulnerable. People who'd recently moved to the area and didn't have established relationships with other doctors. Patients who'd lost their previous physicians to retirement or relocation. People with anxiety or depression who were more likely to trust medical authority and less likely to question diagnoses. He'd falsified hundreds of medical records and prescribed unnecessary medications to at least 75 patients over 6 years. The pharmaceutical payments he'd received totaled nearly $3 million during that period. Several patients had died while under his care, though proving the medications directly caused their deaths was complicated by their existing health conditions. The criminal investigation ran parallel to our civil lawsuit. A prosecutor named Julian Wade brought charges of medical fraud, reckless endangerment, and practicing medicine in a manner dangerous to the public. Dr. Whitmore hired an expensive defense team that immediately began trying to paint him as a dedicated physician who'd made some diagnostic errors, but had never intended to harm anyone. They argued that medical judgment was subjective and that disagreement about treatment approaches didn't constitute criminal conduct. Julian systematically dismantled this defense by showing the deliberate falsification of records, the financial incentives driving his prescribing decisions, and the sheer number of patients who'd been harmed. The evidence was overwhelming. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and I attended every day. Sitting in that courtroom watching Dr. Whitmore in his expensive suit, looking calm and composed, made me feel rage I'd never experienced before. This man had poisoned me for profit. He'd looked me in the eye during appointments, asked how I was feeling, and then deliberately prescribed drugs that made me sicker. He'd manipulated my trust and my fear about my health to justify increasing dosages that benefited his bank account while destroying my quality of life. When I testified about the tremors and memory loss, and the terror of collapsing in a parking lot not knowing what was wrong with me, Dr. Whitmore stared at the table and showed no emotion at all. Claire testified about losing her job because she'd become too anxious and unfocused to perform her duties. Tom described watching his liver function decline while Dr. Whitmore kept assuring him the medications were helping. Alicia broke down on the stand talking about the seizures that had left her afraid to drive or be alone with her infant daughter. Patient after patient described the same pattern of trust betrayed and health destroyed for profit. The pharmaceutical representatives testified about the payment structure and their interactions with Dr. Whitmore. Grace's testimony was particularly damaging because she'd kept detailed records of every meeting and every payment. The defense tried to discredit her by suggesting she had a grudge against her former employer, but her documentation was too thorough to dismiss. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the forewoman read guilty verdicts on all counts. Dr. Whitmore's face finally showed emotion, a flash of shock and fear before he regained his composure. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later. As they let him out of the courtroom, he glanced back at those of us sitting in the gallery. I met his eyes and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He'd be going to prison, and his medical license was permanently revoked. He'd never be able to do this to anyone else. The civil lawsuit settled 2 months later. The pharmaceutical companies agreed to pay a total of $42 million to be distributed among the 75 victims who'd been identified. They also agreed to implement new oversight procedures for their payment arrangements with physicians and to report suspicious prescribing patterns to medical boards. It wasn't nearly enough accountability, but Richard said getting corporations to admit any wrongdoing was rare. The settlement included provisions for continued medical monitoring for all victims, acknowledging that some of the health Effects might be permanent or delayed. I received just over $500,000 after legal fees. It felt like blood money, but I accepted it because my wife and I had medical bills, and I'd lost months of work during the worst of my illness. Dr. Whitmore's sentencing hearing happened on a cold morning in October. I submitted a victim impact statement that was read aloud in court. I described the physical and psychological damage he'd caused, the way I now distrusted all medical professionals and had panic attacks before appointments. I wrote about my wife having to take care of me during the detox period, watching me shake and sweat and struggle to think clearly. I explained that I'd probably never fully recover my sense of security about my own health because I'd learned that the person who was supposed to heal me had deliberately poisoned me instead. The judge sentenced Dr. Whitmore to 12 years in prison, noting that he'd violated the most sacred trust in medicine and had done so repeatedly and knowingly for financial gain. My recovery was slow and uneven. The physical symptoms gradually faded as the drugs left my system, but the psychological impact lingered. I changed jobs because I couldn't focus on complex tasks the way I had before. My wife and I went to therapy together to process what had happened and to rebuild trust in medical professionals. I still had to see doctors occasionally, and each appointment required conscious effort to manage my anxiety. Dr. Ramos remained my primary care physician, and her consistent honesty helped me slowly accept that not all doctors were like Dr. Whitmore. She never minimized what had happened or tried to defend the medical profession. She just treated me with competence and respect and let me ask all the paranoid questions I needed to ask. The pharmaceutical companies implemented their new oversight procedures, but I had no illusions that it would fundamentally change how they operated. They'd paid the settlement as a cost of doing business and would continue incentivizing prescriptions because it remained profitable. The medical board revised their complaint investigation process, supposedly to respond more quickly to patterns of concerning behavior. But systematic change in medical regulation was glacially slow because doctors protected other doctors, and boards were often more concerned with litigation risk than patient safety. Our case had exposed one predatory physician and forced some policy changes, but the underlying structures that had enabled him remained largely intact. Claire started a support group for victims of medical abuse, and I attended a few meetings. Hearing other people's stories helped contextualize my own experience as part of a larger pattern of systemic failure. The medical profession's self-regulation model created situations where patient harm could continue for years before anyone intervened. Economic incentives that paid doctors based on procedure volume or prescriptions written created perverse motivations. The power imbalance between physicians and patients made it difficult to question authority even when something felt wrong. We'd all learned these lessons through direct harm, and now we were trying to educate others so they might avoid similar situations. Tom became an advocate for transparency in pharmaceutical payments, testifying before the state legislature about the need for stricter regulations. His liver damage had been permanent, and he'd required a transplant, so he had both moral authority and personal motivation. He helped pass legislation requiring pharmaceutical companies to publicly disclose all payments to physicians above a certain threshold, and mandating that doctors inform patients about financial relationships that might influence their prescribing decisions. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Small policy changes that might protect a few future patients from predatory doctors motivated by profit. I testified before the medical board during their review of how they'd handled the initial complaints about Dr. Whitmore. I described calling their hotline to report concerns after my hospitalization and being told my complaint would be reviewed in the order it was received with no indication of urgency despite my description of deliberately harmful prescribing. The board members sat there taking notes and looking appropriately concerned, but I could tell they were primarily worried about liability rather than genuinely interested in reforming their processes. One board member actually suggested that patients often misunderstood medical treatment, and that boards had to balance public safety with protecting physicians from unfounded accusations. I asked him directly how many patients needed to be poisoned before a complaint became founded enough to warrant immediate investigation. The media coverage eventually faded and life returned to something approaching normal. My wife and I moved to a different neighborhood because I couldn't drive past Dr. Whitmore's old office without feeling my chest tighten. I found a new job that was less stressful and allowed for flexible scheduling when I had medical appointments. We talked about having children but decided to wait because I wasn't sure I could handle the anxiety of navigating pediatric care with my current level of medical distrust. These were the ongoing costs of what had happened, the ways that Dr. Whitmore's actions continued to shape my life long after he'd gone to prison. Grace lost her job at the pharmaceutical company after testifying against them. She'd known it was likely, but hoped her evidence of their knowing participation in Dr. Whitmore's scheme might be valued. Instead, she was quietly terminated during a supposed restructuring. She filed a wrongful termination lawsuit and eventually settled, but her career in pharmaceutical sales was finished. She ended up working as an advocate for prescription drug pricing. Transparency, using her insider knowledge to expose industry practices. She said testifying had been worth it despite the professional cost because she couldn't have lived with staying silent. Alicia's seizures continued even after stopping the medications that had caused them. Her brain had been permanently altered by the drugs Dr. Whitmore prescribed, creating an acquired seizure disorder that required ongoing treatment. She'd gone from being a healthy young mother to someone who needed anti-seizure medication for the rest of her life, all because a doctor had wanted pharmaceutical company payments. She was raising her daughter while managing a disability that shouldn't exist. The settlement money helped with medical costs, but couldn't give her back the life she'd had before Dr. Whitmore decided she was a useful target for generating prescriptions. I ran into Dr. Whitmore's former receptionist at a coffee shop about 18 months after the trial. She recognized me and looked stricken, like she wanted to disappear. I didn't approach her, but she eventually came over to my table. She said she'd had no idea what Dr. Whitmore was doing, that she'd just scheduled appointments and handled insurance paperwork. She'd lost her job when his practice closed and had struggled to find new employment because of the association. I told her I believed she hadn't known because the whole scheme had been designed to look legitimate to casual observers. But I also said she'd been part of the system that had enabled him, even if unknowingly, and that probably wasn't comfortable to think about. She nodded and left quickly. The nightmares eventually became less frequent but never entirely stopped. I'd dream about being back in Dr. Whitmore's office, watching him write prescriptions while explaining how these medications would help me. In the dreams, I always knew he was lying but couldn't make myself leave or refuse the drugs. I'd wake up with my heart racing, needing several minutes to remember that I was safe, that he was in prison, that I was under the care of doctors I'd carefully vetted. My wife would wake up too and hold me until the panic faded. She'd been traumatized in her own way, watching someone she loved deteriorate and not understanding why, feeling helpless to protect me from a threat she couldn't identify. 2 years after Dr. Whitmore's conviction, I received a letter from the parole board notifying me of his first parole hearing. I wrote a statement opposing early release and several other victims did the same. The board denied parole, citing the severity of his crimes and his lack of genuine remorse. He'd be eligible again in 2 years. I marked the date on my calendar knowing I'd be writing another statement then. This would be part of my life now, this periodic need to argue that the man who'd poisoned me should remain imprisoned. Small administrative tasks that represented ongoing engagement with trauma that couldn't fully heal. Claire Z. Support group grew to include victims of other forms of medical abuse. Patients who'd been sexually assaulted by physicians, people who'd received unnecessary surgeries from doctors motivated by profit, families of patients who died due to grossly negligent care. The common thread was betrayal by medical professionals and the devastating impact of having the person who was supposed to heal you cause harm instead. We met monthly and shared strategies for coping with medical anxiety and navigating healthcare systems while managing trauma. The group became a reminder that my experience, while extreme, wasn't unique. Medical abuse happened regularly and was often handled inadequately by oversight systems designed to protect institutions rather than patients. I started writing about my experience, first in blog posts and then in articles for patient advocacy publications. I detailed what had happened and what I'd learned about how pharmaceutical companies incentivized prescriptions and how medical boards failed to protect patients from predatory doctors. Some physicians reacted defensively, saying I was undermining public trust in medicine. But many more reached out to say they'd witnessed similar behaviors and felt powerless to report them because of professional loyalty expectations and fear of retaliation. The medical community's code of silence was strong, and whistleblowers often faced severe consequences. Change required both external pressure from patients and internal courage from ethical physicians willing to challenge dangerous colleagues. Tom's transplant had been successful, but his medical bills were enormous, despite the settlement money. He'd developed complications that required multiple additional surgeries, and his insurance had fought coverage at every step. The financial stress added to the trauma of what had been done to him. His wife had to quit her job to manage his medical care full-time, and they'd burned through most of their savings. They'd filed for bankruptcy and were trying to rebuild their lives while he recovered from major surgery that should never have been necessary. His case illustrated how medical harm created cascading consequences that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage. The state medical board finally implemented new protocols for investigating complaints. They created a rapid response team for cases involving multiple similar complaints about the same physician. They established clearer standards for what constituted suspicious prescribing patterns. They added patient representatives to their review committees. These changes wouldn't have happened without our case forcing public scrutiny, but I couldn't celebrate them too enthusiastically knowing how many patients had been harmed before the board finally acted. Regulatory reform was always reactive, coming after victims had already suffered rather than preventing harm in the first place. 5 years after that first collapse in the parking lot, I stood in my kitchen making coffee and realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about Dr. Whitmore. This felt significant. This evidence that trauma eventually occupied less mental space, even if it never disappeared completely. My hands were steady as I poured the water. No tremors, no intrusive memories of when I couldn't control my own body. I was healthier now than I'd been during those 6 months of being systematically poisoned. My new doctors had carefully monitored me and found no lasting organ damage. I'd been lucky in ways that Tom and Alicia hadn't been. My body had recovered even if my psyche bore permanent scars. My wife found me standing there with my coffee mug and asked what I was thinking about. I told her I'd realized I was okay. Really okay, in a way I hadn't been sure was possible. She hugged me and said she'd known I'd get here eventually but had worried during the early years when I'd seemed so broken by what had happened. We talked about trying to have children again, and this time I didn't immediately feel panicked about navigating pediatric care. Maybe I was ready. Maybe enough time had passed and enough healing had happened. Or maybe I'd just accepted that life contained risks and that hypervigilance about medical care couldn't eliminate those risks entirely. Dr. Whitmore served 8 years of his 12-year sentence before dying of a heart attack in prison. I got the notification from Victim Services and felt nothing except a dull sense of completion. He'd never apologize or express genuine remorse or provide answers about why he'd done what he'd done. Those possibilities had ended with his death, and I had to accept that closure wasn't something external that would be granted to me. It was something I'd been building internally through therapy and advocacy work and the slow process of reconstructing trust in medical care. His death didn't change my recovery trajectory because my healing had stopped being about him years ago. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So, subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.